My name is Greg Fox, and I'm the director of the Program for International Legal Studies, and thank you all for coming here. One of the best parts of my job is to get to know graduates of Wayne Law School who have gone on to work on international issues, and I am so happy today to introduce one of the best examples of that type of alum, Sylvia Clear, who comes to us from the General Counsel's office at Ford. I won't say anything more about Sylvia because that's what she's going to do. She's going to tell you about herself and international law opportunities. Sylvia is one of many Wayne grads who have gone down this path, and so it is possible. There are jobs out there, and this is a wonderful opportunity for you to find out how you can best prepare yourself for the type of work that Sylvia does. I should mention that Sylvia is a member of the advisory committee of the Program for International Legal Studies, and we benefit greatly from her thoughts about our program. Please join in welcoming Sylvia Clear.
Hi, and thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure, and I feel very honored to be here and to have the opportunity to speak with you and to share my experiences that I've had since I graduated from law school here a very long time ago, probably longer than I care to think about. But nonetheless, it's a great place to start your career, and I'm happy to talk about the path that I've taken, as well as answer any questions when I'm done about what your thoughts are and the issues that you're facing now, and happy to add any advice that I can share with you. As Greg mentioned, President Fox mentioned, I am a lawyer at Ford Motor Company, and I've been there for close to 15 years already. I started at Ford in the consumer commercial lending area at Ford Credit, really is their financing subsidiary. And I was there for about 5 years, but then I went to what is now the Global Trade and Transactions Group, formerly the International Group. And there I have had kind of great opportunities to do a lot of work in international law. Interestingly, international law is a very, very broad term. I'm not sure that they're in the business world that the definition is kind of the same as you would look at it in an academic point of view, but I will tell you that probably just like you, I was interested in international law as a law student. I was president of the International Law Society when I was here at Penn State, and I've been fortunate to be able to ultimately practice in that area. What that has meant for me has been kind of two different things. One is that I've been able to be the business lawyer for a business unit within Ford called Emerging Market Services that basically was doing kind of soup to nuts business all around the world in emerging markets in Asia Pacific, in Middle East, Africa, and Caribbean, Central America. So I was really able to get a very good understanding of the Ford business and how you can develop business in markets all around the world. And it really was covering everything from marketing to product issues to distribution to servicing customers after vehicle sales, really just the gamut of business in that very small context, or big context, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And then the other area of law that I've been able to practice in is that I am the lawyer at Ford who is responsible for export controls and economic sanctions issues. And I don't know to what extent you're familiar with those, but they are really legal issues that are based on U.S. foreign policy and national security concerns. And basically, there's two different areas. The export controls area is where the U.S. government regulates what technology may be shared with people with different countries and people from those countries. So for example, if, and I'm just going to give very general examples, but for example, night vision technology or even GPS technology for a very long time was highly controlled because that was viewed as a military type of technology. And now, you know, certainly it's become very common, and we all have it on our cell phones and maybe in our cars. But that's the type of technology that was kind of viewed as military technology that you didn't want to have in the hands of different countries that might use it for what the U.S. would consider bad purposes. And so that's a very important area, especially now that companies, including car companies that historically used very long-standing and basic technology to develop their vehicles. Vehicles have become highly electronic, highly sophisticated with their technology, and that's a very big emerging area of law and practice and legal practice in the business world. And then the other part of that is economic sanctions law, which is very related to that, but if you've been paying attention to recent current events, you would know that economic sanctions against Cuba and Iran have been very hot issues recently in U.S. national foreign policy, and there have been many developments in that area as well. So I'm responsible for compliance with all of those laws and regulations at FORB. How did I get here? That's a very good question and a great one for students. So I will talk about that. I will say that, as I mentioned earlier, I was always interested in international issues, mostly because of my personal background. I was born in Argentina and grew up in a very, so I'm an immigrant myself and grew up in an immigrant household and was able to experience other cultures and travel around the world. When I was at the University of Michigan for undergrad, I was a study abroad student. I studied in France for a year and was able to speak French. And so because I spoke Spanish and French, and after undergrad, I went to Washington, D.C. because I had a political science and language background, and that's where you go when you have that kind of background and you need a job. So I did that after undergrad, and certainly that developed my interest in international law. That being said, I came back here to Wayne State, which is kind of in, close to where I grew up, and went to law school here and had that interest in international law. Little did I know what international law really meant. It means a lot of different things to different people. There's public international law and private international law. But certainly my experience is in commercial international law. And those are really the two areas that at least commercially exist, is really doing all kinds of commercial law locally and kind of taking that to an international level and maybe applying it to your business abroad. And then this area of export controls and economic sanctions law. Those are, in my view, two big areas. Certainly there's others, intellectual property and even franchising law. I mean, really anything that a company does locally, antitrust issues, anything that you do locally also has similar laws that are applicable outside of the U.S. And sometimes you have to figure out how to work with both of them. And sometimes there's conflicts in those laws and you have to resolve those conflicts, and sometimes you don't need to. So those are kind of the way that those issues come up. But going back to kind of how I got there, I will say that I started off in consumer and commercial finance. First, my first job out of law school was at Chrysler Financial Corporation, which used to be the financial arm of then Chrysler Corporation. And there's always a little bit of luck, I will say, in terms of any job, how your career starts in any direction. And even though I really can say it now, that was not necessarily specifically an area of law that I was interested in. What I did know at the time was that I was interested in doing something international, and certainly since Chrysler was an international corporation, I figured that would be at least my best bet in terms of a place to start given the opportunities that I had to choose from. So, don't be too limiting with yourself and saying, thinking that you're going to get to your destination in terms of what you want to work on at the beginning. I think you kind of have to take your opportunities as they come and make your best choices that are available to you. So from Chrysler, I went somewhat laterally to Ford Credit, which is also the financial arm of Ford. But I went there because I knew that Ford had a lot more international business available. And as it turned out, an opportunity arose after I was there for several years, and I was able to move to the International Law Department. And, somewhat serendipitously, I will say that, and I'm not sure anybody would have told you this going into it, but I will say that having a background in consumer and commercial law was an excellent background for what I ended up doing in the international law area. And the reason is that I had regulatory experience, and I understood what regulatory work was like and how regulators may view the laws that are applicable to your business, and that it's not necessarily always based on the words in the regulations, and that there are policies behind that, and that they enforce it in different ways, and that you have to take a lot of compliance measures in documentation and other applications to deal with regulatory matters. And so, you don't want to necessarily look at anything you do too narrowly because you never know what other applications it may have. I think that the best thing you can do is try to do something as substantive as possible and see how you can apply your knowledge. Use the knowledge you obtain to apply it to any other area that may arise. I was going to talk about jobs in international law, but I think I kind of did that, at least in terms of my experience. I really view that, we're very lucky here in Detroit, obviously, to have not only these big car manufacturers that do so much international work, but also a tremendous supplier base. And the suppliers to the auto industry, which are extremely numerous, are also just as international as anybody else. So I would say that Detroit is actually an incredible place to seek jobs in international law, or at least in international business, because it has, there's just so much of it here in our backyard. The other thing, certainly immigration is another area of international law that is very big in this area, and it's both on the personal level and families, as well as in a commercial context, because companies hire a lot of foreign nationals as well, and especially going back to the area of export controls that I talked about, there are a lot of very technical talent has to be found all over the world because our world is getting so technical. And so immigration is a very big issue. It's a very big legal issue and also a big area of international practice. And interestingly enough, immigration law overlaps to some extent with export controls, because as I mentioned, export controls regulates technology for certain countries as well as nationals from those countries. And so you have to be very careful and sometimes work with the government in seeking licenses, for example, to allow foreign nationals to work on certain sophisticated technology that may be controlled for the countries that they are from. And so that is an area where those two subject matters intersect. My suggestion for students and people like you are really just to, right now is the time that you have available to prepare yourself and to do as much as possible to build your resume and to also start learning about what the world is like outside of the classroom. Certainly, what you learn here is very important, and how you do your classes and kind of being a good student is very important. But it's also a time to kind of begin to get an understanding of the world around you and take whatever opportunities are available to you, whether it's participation in extracurricular activities here at the law school, whether it's doing some practical clinics that teach you different skills that you can later say that you have that kind of sets you apart from other students, being active in student organizations that give you some substantive knowledge and access to speakers and to people who are out there working. And certainly all of the different organizations, whether it's in international law with the Jessup competition or Moot Court, or I remember the Free Legal Aid Clinic that we have. I assume it's still going strong. Certainly during your summers when you have time off, I would do the best you can to get the most substantive work that you can find. And I know there's always this tension between having to make money and supporting yourself, and there's often jobs that don't pay very much, but certainly in the long run, to the extent that you can do it, it's always beneficial to choose the most substantive experience you can find so that you can build from that, because that's also an investment of your time into your own education and your ability to distinguish yourself from other students and people in your position. Just to talk about a little bit more about current issues, I mentioned kind of the recent sanctions easing, I would call them, on both Cuba and Iran. That's just a really fascinating area of law, the economic sanctions area. I know that if you open up some popular magazines right now, even on the internet, you'll find all kinds of advertising for travel, for example, to Cuba and Iran, and people think that they've opened up all of a sudden, and let me tell you that there are still significant sanctions on both of those countries, especially for U.S. persons. And that's just an area that right now is very hot because they're both markets that have been closed for a very long time to Americans and to U.S. companies. And there are a lot of people who are very interested in doing business there or even going there for travel. And the penalties associated with violations of sanctions laws are, on the civil side, can be $250,000 per violation, and a violation would, it's every single time you potentially break the law in that area, as well as criminal penalties, where people absolutely go to jail for violation of sanctions. And it's very, very complicated area of law and really fascinating because there are the policy around that, the opening, the easing of those markets, easing of the sanctions for opening those markets are very limited, and it takes a tremendous amount of effort to, especially in a global company, to even make determinations about what that means for you. And I won't go too far into it, but I will say that, for example, the U.S. policy on Iran, for example, has opened the door, it has been a removal of secondaries, what we call secondary sanctions. And those are sanctions that are applicable to non-US companies. And so what that has done is significantly opened the Iranian market for non-US companies and has really given a lot of opportunities to really the competition of American companies. But certainly, you know, they are very complicated policy issues, and practitioners in this area basically look at those laws to determine, you know, what can be done and whether something can be done. Because it's not only the legal issues around it, but it's also reputational issues for the companies. And those sanctions also have significant, what we call snapback provisions, which basically say that if Iran breaches the agreements that were entered into, the sanctions can be very quickly reimposed. That's just from the JCPOA perspective, which is the international agreement that was entered into. But then additionally, there's certainly the potential of political change on the horizon with the upcoming elections, and the executive office has the ability to take executive actions to change those sanctions as well. I will make a comment that the JCPOA agreement, the easing of those sanctions, only address nuclear sanctions, and the U.S. has all kinds of sanctions that are non-nuclear, for example, related to human rights issues, ballistic missile technology, and other types of sanctions. And so that's the JCPOA agreement only addressed the nuclear sanctions, and there's just a plethora of other existing sanctions against Iran. So sanctions are very complicated with regard to Cuba, for example, and it's also true for Iran. Some of them are statutory, some of them are based on executive action, some of them depend on the type of reasoning behind the sanctions, and so there is a lot that the executive office can do. I know there's a lot of press around whether or not the executive has the power to remove sanctions or not, or to what extent. And it's a very, very complicated issue, but there are also a lot of laws that have been passed by Congress related to sanctions, some of which may be waived by the president and some of which may not. So very interesting area, sometimes controversial, and certainly complex and interesting with regard to the practice of law. One thing I would add is with regard to working for in-house, being inside counsel, I guess I want to touch on this point really quickly of being inside counsel and outside counsel. Inside counsel being that you are kind of a lawyer internally for a company, as opposed to outside counsel, which typically works at a law firm, is that I guess I would advocate very strongly for the advantages of being an inside counsel. And that is that you really have the opportunity to be a part of the business team. Particularly at Ford, the Office of the General Counsel is highly integrated with the business in that we are part of decision-making at the business level from the very beginning. And that makes your job so much better in significant ways. For example, you get to help the business develop strategy. You really become tied to the goals of the business, and you feel part of that business. You're a key member of the business team and are able to participate in very high-level decisions. And luckily, Ford is a company that integrates its legal office into its business operations in all aspects, I guess, of its business operations. Some companies don't do that even. Some companies have inside counsel who are just called in when there are problems that arise, and they say, hey, we've got legal problems, go fix them. And that's, in my opinion, not a place that would be a very different type of practice, I would say that. because you'd rather be involved in setting up structures that work for you legally instead of having to just show up to clean up somebody's mess. So I find that to be very rewarding at Ford, to be part of the business team and to be involved in all those planning decisions, as well as getting the opportunity to work on just as pretty much the cutting edge of every legal issue that arises can be found in an international company like Ford, and that is a great opportunity to have. So I think that's kind of my main presentation, but I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. Yes.
So you mentioned the easing of sanctions on Iran and Cuba. What impact have you seen on the flip side of that with the placing of sanctions on Russia?
Yeah, Russia, we went through a very intense period, you're right, with sanctions against Russia. And the way that those were done were very different than the sanctions that we have against Iran and Cuba, because what ended up happening, within sanctions there are, one way that we sanction, sanctions work is usually they are against individuals, or they may be against entities, or they may be against countries. And that's kind of the traditional way that you see sanctions. What the U.S. government did with regard to Russia was a little bit different, because while they did sanction certain individuals and certain entities, they took a very international approach in terms of coordinating their sanctions with the Europeans and other countries. And they decided to do what we call sectoral sanctions, and they went after certain sectors of the economy because, you know, I guess I'm sure there are very many different reasons why, but the global economy is now a lot more tied to Russia than maybe it was in the past. And so the U.S. as well as the Europeans took a different approach this time and issued sectoral sanctions, a lot of which were aimed at the financial sector in Russia. And in addition, they did issue sanctions against Crimea, which is also a territory and doesn't fit into the traditional person, entity, or country. And so it was kind of a new approach, and that was a very hot topic when those were occurring, I don't know, within the last year or so. But that was very interesting as well. Yes?
So what was your knowledge of business and marketing and business operations before you got into Ford, or did you just learn all of that side of it once you arrived?
Yes, I mean, I definitely did not. When I graduated from undergraduate, I was in Washington, and I worked for a company that tracked legislative issues for different companies, but it was really mostly focused on legislation and what was going on in Washington. So I did not necessarily have any business experience, and it's just something that I was able to learn along the way. I was lucky to get in-house right out of law school, which is sometimes unusual, but not completely. I know Ford has, in the last several years, reinstituted its summer intern program, and we do recruit from Wayne State University Law School. And that is now the main way that we hire into the OGC is through our summer intern program. So I did not have, I would say, a lot of business background, but I picked it up along the way, and I know, friends of mine have in the past, when I've been dealing with issues, say, gosh, how do you know what the answer is? And I remember, I think that's the learning curve you go through when you first get into practice is, there's so many issues. The black and white issues nobody cares about because those are the easy ones. I mean, they care about them, but those are the ones that you don't spend much time on because they're black and white. The issues you spend time on are the gray area, and having to advise people on what's not clear under the law and what risks are risks that you should take and which ones are the risks that are too risky. And it's just a sense that you kind of develop over time, but it certainly requires you to understand the business and the operation of the business to be able to develop your judgment on what makes sense in terms of balancing risk. And that's something that you just have to gain with experience. Yes?
So I assume for like a different branch of some company like Ford, where you have outposts maybe in European countries, that you have counsel from those countries that work there, how much contact do you have with lawyers in those countries, or how much overlap is there in what you know and what they know, or is it typically very separate, or what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the answer to that question has really evolved in the last maybe 10 years at Ford, and it depends on which company you work for and how they're organized. When I first joined the group that I'm in now in the OGC, it was called the International Section. And the reason for that was that it was really kind of a centralized legal department that had a lot of influence and made a lot of decisions that affected our foreign subsidiaries. But as our foreign subsidiaries have grown and matured and to the point where they needed to have their own lawyers locally, we now have local legal offices in many of our foreign subsidiaries around the world. So we certainly have offices and we have a lot of different offices around the world. The countries are relatively obvious in terms of the global economy, but we have significant legal offices in Europe and Asia Pacific, now in the Middle East and Africa, in South America, in Mexico and Canada. I'm not sure if I'm in Africa, I'm not sure if I missed any part of the world, but we have them pretty much everywhere. And as companies globalize, you have to develop local talent and you have to develop local legal offices. And you have to be able to make those coordinations in terms of kind of bringing all your lawyers together and educating them. We have a program at Ford where we bring in our foreign lawyers into our office and give them somewhat of an orientation. And we have global policies that are developed here in Dearborn, but that are applicable around the world. You did make kind of me remember to mention another area of law that's certainly very international in focus, and that's anti-corruption laws. And the U.S. has a very aggressive anti-corruption statute called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that is applicable all over the world. The UK now has kind of the most aggressive anti-corruption statute that is applicable all around the world. So anti-corruption policies and practice is a very strong area, I would say, as well in international law. But most companies, including Ford, have a compliance department which focuses on ensuring that its global business subsidiaries they develop policies and procedures and handbooks and training programs and all kinds of things to ensure that the global operations practice within its policies and procedures, including legal compliance. And that compliance area is a very hot area of the law as well.
So if I could just follow up on that question. So at the foreign subsidiary, say in Mexico, would Ford have exclusively Mexican lawyers, or would there be American lawyers who might be posted to the foreign subsidiaries?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that the way that it typically happens is that when those offices begin, usually there is a U.S. lawyer who is sent for a 3-year period to a local office, to some kind of international, some non-U.S. location. And eventually, they hire people locally and you might have a U.S. person initially leading the operation and training people, but usually it's very expensive to have kind of continually have what we call international service employees, which is basically U.S. employees that go to our foreign subsidiaries to do legal work or any other kind of work. And so what you want to do is develop local talent, but you have to train them, you have to familiarize them with your company and your culture and your procedures, and that happens over time. So usually it's a question of how mature the market is, and when it first starts out, you typically have U.S. lawyers abroad, and then eventually that transitions into local talent. That being said, there are always some U.S. lawyers who are in our foreign subsidiaries, not in all of them, but those opportunities definitely arise. Sure.
When a major auto company faces crisis mode, as Volkswagen's dealing with right now, or Ford did with the Firestone thing 15 years ago or so, how the legal folks are going to react to something like that? Is that something that you war game in advance, or is it kind of a reactive thing?
When there are crises?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Ford has a very specific way of governing its business. What you saw at Volkswagen, I think is mostly due to, or it's understood to have been a result of them not having very good corporate governance procedures in place and to not having a very organized corporate governance system where people were very clear about the policies and procedures of the company. Corporate governance is something that has been very important at Ford. Ford has a very strong, they have a very, I don't know if, when Alan Mulally came to Ford from Microsoft, he developed what we call a creating value roadmap, and it was really a policy, a whole company policy that was geared at unifying both the business units and the skill teams. And it's a whole governance process where literally every, I don't remember, 2 to 3 weeks, each business unit and each skill team is required to report up to upper management on all of the issues that are arising in the company that need attention. And the point that he made, and this is not at all private, and this is publicly known information, but it's not confidential at all, but basically one of the issues that Alan Mulally had, and one of his big impacts on Ford when he got there, was when he initially arrived, he went to an executive meeting and said, what's going on, tell me about what problems you're facing. And his response from the management team was, oh, we don't have any problems. And he said, well, how can that be? You're losing money, you've got all he kind of outlined what are very well-known problems at Ford and in the auto industry, and said, what do you mean you don't have problems? And so that was kind of a big cultural issue that was part of Ford at the time that he arrived. And what he instituted was this creating value roadmap and BPR, business planning review process, where it was a whole process that really starts from the ground up. And the whole purpose of it is to have senior managers review issues, I don't want to even say problems, but issues that are going on in the company, so that they get the review and attention by all of the skill teams and all the business units, so that solutions can be found at the best level.
Instead of this big.
Exactly. So it's really a process of addressing issues as they arise and getting the attention that they need. And so there was kind of this cultural change that had to happen where previously it was kind of killing the messenger and you didn't want to report out problems, to encouraging issues to be discussed and addressed. And his, point was you can't manage a secret. And so you needed to kind of have those issues come to the top and be addressed as effectively as possible by the best talent you have and the people empowered to do so. And that is the corporate governance that Ford has adopted. It's now part of one of its corporate policies and philosophies that is now built into the infrastructure of how we do business. So that is, I guess, one way that we would say that, hopefully an issue like that would not occur. Yes?
Well, thank you for being here. I guess somewhat related to that question is, to what extent do you find yourself thinking proactively, I guess, about global developments with potential legal consequences, as opposed to more of a reactionary decision, in your office?
Yeah, good question, and it's definitely what we're challenged with every single day in terms of, every single day you have people coming to you with questions and fires that need to get put out, and you have to deal with all of the immediate needs of the business. But you certainly are judged in many ways in terms of your job performance and what you got done and what needle were you able to move to make a difference in the company. And that's where thinking proactively and acting proactively comes about. So it's just something that I would say a company like Ford offers you the world of opportunity in terms of addressing issues. I mean, you'll never stop having the opportunity to address important issues in a company as big as Ford, or I'm sure in a company as small, in any company. So it's just really the need to, and part of, like I said, this BPR process where you have to report issues up is how you get the opportunity to do that. Because when you identify issues and you bring them to people's attention, somebody has to take action on them. And they are, there's a lot of documentation around that and the need to address it. And there's auditing, systems built into the company in terms of auditing policies and procedures. And there's a way to escalate issues to ensure that they get the proper attention. And to the extent that you can be proactive to address issues that come up, you are required to do that, and people are expecting you to do that. And then I would say that the other proactive way to do it is kind of how we are built into the business and decision making, and how you can really try to address issues structurally up front instead of when it's too late. Yes?
How has export control reform impacted your job? Like pre-export control reform versus right now, what's currently going on right now? What is it like?
So just to clarify, when you mean export control reform, because there have been some reforms within, kind of, for example, some of the reforms have been in terms of merging responsibility for what, there are two sets of regulatory schemes. One is the Export Administration Rules and the International Traffic Dam Regulations. Is that what you're talking about, where they've tried to kind of combine that a little bit?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'll start out to say that, Ford does not have a lot of controlled technology. We are not a military, we do not deal in defense articles. We're not registered to do military work with the U.S. government. So that's not something that has a significant impact on us. Certainly we have technologies that we pay attention to, but it's not a very it's still kind of a very minimal area for us. We're not in the defense industry. I'd say those reforms have a much bigger impact on defense manufacturers, which we are not. There's some impact from that, but for us it has been minimal. Okay, well, it was a pleasure to speak with you. I'll be hang around here for a few more minutes. If anyone wants to come up and ask individual questions, I'm happy to answer them, and happy to be available for questions, and I hope you got something out of the presentation.